Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This podcast is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, a new online collection of practical, trusted resources made for those who support global missions from home. Visit us online at globalmissionstoolbox.com to register for access to this growing collection of tools for senders. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Today, we're going to talk about one of the things many believe is essential for most organizations to thrive and grow: innovation. We simply cannot continue to do everything in exactly the same way and expect to be relevant and effective. Today, we'll talk again with a familiar guest and unpack what he thinks about innovation in missions. Our guest today is Ted Esler, who since 2015 now has served as the president of Missio Nexus. Missio Nexus is an association of mission agencies and churches representing about 30,000 Great Commission workers. Ted, the majority of those are from North America, serving in other places, right?
That's correct. We just had a recent survey done, and we think it's around 60,000 globally dispersed staff.
Wow, that is tremendous. So Ted is just really strategically placed for not only this conversation, but a lot of missions-related conversations. I'll just say by way of biography, Ted worked in the computer industry before he became a church planter. He was in Eastern Europe in the 90s. He has served with Pioneers during these years as well. He was the executive director of Pioneers Canada, served on the leadership team of Pioneers USA. He is a leader, a podcaster. We'll link to your podcast in the show notes, Ted. It's called Mission Matters, together with Matthew Ellison of 1615. And Ted is an author. And particularly today, we're going to talk a little bit about his 2021 book, The Innovation Crisis: Creating Disruptive Influence in the Ministry You Lead. You've already done 2 episodes with us, Ted, so we'll say welcome back to the program.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Just as we begin today, let's remind our listeners a little bit about Missio Nexus. What is this association?
Well, Missio Nexus exists to catalyze relationships, ideas, and collaboration within the Great Commission community. And those 3 things, relationships, ideas, and collaboration, go all the way back to the founding of our kind of predecessor associations back to 1917. And what we try to do is get people that are working in the Great Commission to do shared learning and challenge them with new ideas and figure out how to work together. So that is what we're all about: relationships, ideas, and collaboration.
When we've had Ted on this program before, the 2 previous episodes, it's been mostly regarding trends, what's going on in missions. The last one had a bit to do with COVID in particular. In this episode, we're going to drill into a topic that's been a key focus for Missio Nexus and for Ted over the last couple of years. Ted, what led you to write this book, The Innovation Crisis?
Well, a couple of years ago, I noted that many of the CEOs that are part of our network, so there's about, on a monthly basis, I send out a piece of correspondence to CEOs. There's about 325 mission agency CEOs on that mailing list. Now, we also do one for church leaders, but this one I'm talking about is for the mission agencies. And they often ask me the question, who is the most innovative agency out there? You know, I think they're looking for ideas. And I noticed that I struggled. I just could not give them more than a very short list of names. And I began to think more and more about innovation in the ministry space. And I realized that it was not happening, nowhere near as it happens in the business or the commercial world. And that led me to think we have a crisis of innovation.
Ted, as we've been visiting a little bit about your book, you've mentioned with appreciation seeing how it's being used. Give us an example of how you've seen it being used, not just because it's your book, but it's really coming to life.
You know, I think it's most powerful to think about innovation with the people that you're going to be innovating with in ministry. And so a number of churches, a number of mission agencies, I'm thinking of one large publishing company they bought a book for each member of the leadership team. They're reading a chapter. Each chapter has questions at the end of it. They're going through that process. And, the book is not an end-all on innovation, but I think what it does is it whets the appetite. It opens your eyes to ways that ministries can adopt an innovative culture and an innovative mindset. And it's really that team doing that together where the real power is.
Well, that makes sense, right? Instead of having just one advocate and somebody reads a book and thinks it's great, as opposed to processing it together and not having a single advocate, but really, processing it together.
Yeah.
Well, you use this term crisis. That sounds like a serious problem. Is it, Ted? Is it really that bad?
Well, I would just, I would point your listener to think about Jesus and how innovative Jesus was. He was so innovative that his followers, at times, they just wanted him to stop talking because the things he was saying were so just, mind-bending and culture-stretching. They were hard things to hear. He talked about the new kingdom, the new covenant, how we need to think about the kind of wineskins we put things into. I could go on and on. He was an innovator. If you lived in the first century and you talked to, if you were in Jerusalem and somebody said, hey, who's the most innovative person in our culture? I can't imagine somebody wouldn't say the name Jesus. So, we're born out of this innovation piece. We should be the best at it. But in reality, I don't think people think about us in the church as innovative in our culture today.
It's just as you talk about Jesus' influence and the reaction to him, it was pretty clear that disruptive innovation was very uncomfortable for the establishment too.
Oh, yeah, especially the establishment.
Yeah. Well, I could ask you whether you think there's an innovation crisis in missions, but that's what your book is about. Let me go past that, assuming you already have said that there is a crisis. Why is this crisis important? Why is innovation, rather, that's a better way to say it on the positive side, why is innovation so important to this missions endeavor?
There's a lot wrapped up in that question, but let me just say that we live in a rapidly changing environment. And if we don't innovate, then we become irrelevant. Now, the message we have is a, timeless message. We're not going to innovate on just the facts of the gospel, what Jesus has done for us, etc. But in every generation, that message has to come through the generation's culture. In every culture, it has to come through the culture's way of hearing and understanding. And the rapid pace of change is just forcing us to really think about how to be innovative in communicating and living out that message.
Well, that's a great clarification, right? That we are not changing the message at all. It's an unchanging gospel, but then you said how. So we need to think about how we're delivering or how we're communicating the unchanging message. What are some of the reasons that you think there are barriers? Why are our ministry leaders struggling to innovate or just plain do not innovate?
Well, I'll just give you a couple thoughts on that. So one reason why is because we're people and it's hard for most people to innovate. So it really doesn't, that one's not necessarily tied to ministry, but we carry with us the same hindrances that many people have. But I would say for ministry specifically, there's a few things. One thing I think that is important is that in business, when you have competition is a great motivator for innovation. And when you see what somebody else is doing, you think about what you're doing, et cetera, that drives you to be creative. Now, in ministry, our competition is not another ministry. It is not another podcast if we're podcasters. It's not another church if we're a church. It's not another mission agency if we're a mission agency. You name the ministry. We should not be in competition with other people in ministry, but we're in competition with the world as it's expressed in culture. And as we mentioned before, because culture is undergoing such rapid change, we have become irrelevant in our context. And this is why innovation is important to us. But understanding culture and speaking to culture is not easy. And again, I want to point to Jesus here. Jesus did something that was anybody who's a teacher should really listen to this teaching principle of Jesus. Jesus was fully Jewish in his message. When somebody listened to Jesus, they knew they were listening to a Jew because he spoke their language. He understood their world. He understood their worldview. Everything that he did was highly placed into the context of first century Judaism. On the other hand, he was very countercultural. He said things that were offensive to the culture. He questioned the institutions of the culture. He went against the grain. And so this idea of taking two seemingly opposing ideas, being very much a part of the culture while being very confrontive of the culture, is what made Jesus' teaching so spicy and so interesting and so worth listening to. Similarly, as we try to couch our message in ways that we, understand, we're not just talking about succumbing to the culture. We also need the spiciness. We need to call out the things in culture that need confrontation. That's really hard to do. And many of our primary leaders in our churches are pastoral. And by that, I mean they're there to provide care, not necessarily confrontation. And if you think about how many Christian leaders today are out there really calling the culture to task, that's not a long list. And I would just say that these things, the funding models that we have are also, we have a stewardship mentality when it comes to money. Somebody gives you a gift, your job is to steward that gift. Innovation often requires risky investments with money. And the whole process of how we fund ministry kind of goes against that grain. I mean, we literally could unpack numerous ways that innovation is difficult in ministry, but all of these things kind of conspire against us in leadership.
Boy, it's the both and of being fully in the culture, but countercultural at the same time. Great tension in a both and there. I wonder, Ted, one of the concerns that I've heard raised about innovation is drifting, mission drift it's sometimes called, right? And the idea that, we're trying to be faithful here. We're trying to be faithful. We shouldn't change. How would you respond to somebody who says we just need to stay true to what we're doing?
When somebody says we want to stay true to what we're doing, I would question what they're actually staying true to. And this isn't a criticism, or it's not intended to be provocative, but the fact is we often exchange methodology for really the prime mission that we have in ministry. So I'll give you an example. The church growth movement came about through Donald McGavran and others, and it was an awesome movement. The church grew. Now, there's a lot of critiques of it, I know, but there's no doubt that the church growth movement created a very significant movement of church planting in the U.S. and Canada. And that whole seeker-sensitive model kind of grew up out of that garden, if you will. Many of the methodologies that were being used at that time, they were innovative in their day, and the people that were being faithful really questioned those methodologies. Well, today, the people that are doing that growth, the church growth stuff, they see themselves as the faithful ministers, and people that are doing new things are seen as not maybe being so faithful. It's the change dynamic that we're up against here. A little phrase I like, it goes like this. It's when your methodology becomes your theology, your ecclesiology becomes a pathology. And basically, we have a tendency to think the gospel is, for example, the 4 spiritual laws. That's a method. That is not the gospel. We need to learn to separate those kinds of things and understand that, again, this is human nature. Human nature is to see how something is being done and assume that is also the why. And in our ministries, it's very easy to fall prey to, I can give you COVID as an example. When COVID happened, I was thinking to myself, wow, we are going to see massive innovation in the church because people cannot meet virtually now. What most churches did is the exact same thing they were doing before COVID, only in video format. And, sure, that's somewhat innovative, I guess, but it really didn't take advantage of the new opportunities that were present in this new COVID environment. I mean, you could have used the vast resources of the internet to buttress your teaching. I think of I have aging elderly parents. They live in Minnesota. And it was COVID season there. It was cold and it was lockdown. They were lonely. They had this idea, and they're in a risk group, so they didn't want to break any rules. So they innovated. They went out and they bought themselves a bunch of turkeys and ham. And at Easter, they made like 40 meals, and they drove them to all of their friends and dropped them on the doorstep. And then everybody had Easter dinner together in their homes. Very innovative, considering what they were up against. But I'm not sure we did that in the ministry context so much. I think we left some things undone there.
Well, I hear a little bit of concern, regret, whatever, that we haven't taken full advantage, or at least we haven't yet taken full advantage of maybe the opportunity that these pandemic limitations have brought to us. And I did hear you saying that really we're wrestling with change, not necessarily with what we're doing. And we're back to the same where you started, that the gospel hasn't changed. The gospel message hasn't changed. It's how we are doing ministry that really needs or benefits from reconsideration there. Well, as we think about this in the missions world, Ted, and we think about people who are working with goers and senders, that's the language we use here, goers being the missionaries and senders being, they may be pastors, missions committees, churches, donors. How are you suggesting that we can better go about innovating in our ministries?
Well, I don't want to just, pump the book here, but I have a chapter in the book. It's chapter 7. And chapter 7 lists 9 different areas specific to ministry that are ripe for innovation.
Okay. And don't be shy about that. That's why we wanted to talk with you about your book. So take us through a few. Maybe we won't get all 9, but a few, please.
Well, I'll give you an example of one. It kind of gets to what we're talking about and how Jesus communicates. But one of the areas that I talk about in the book is identity. Identity provides a great way for us to innovate in ministry, whether we're goers or senders. So, for example, in the sending world, one of the criticisms that you'll hear is that agencies are only looking for money from churches. And that is an identity issue. And unfortunately, I've been involved with the Global Great Commission long enough to know that sometimes it's true. It's true that people are fundraising from churches, and that's about as far as the relationship goes. But if you can change the way that you identify the church in the process of the Global Great Commission, instead of just being a funder, but as a partner, it can have lots of downstream ramifications. And this kind of thing can reverberate in a lot of different areas. My sending church, many years ago, I was in Eastern Europe, and they were fantastic in how they supported us financially. And, we just loved them to pieces. They were great. They came over on a visit. For the first time, I heard from them, we don't want to just be involved with Ted and Nettie. We want to see this culture reached. And they changed their own identity from, hey, we're just going to be funding and praying for, to we want to be involved with multiple missionaries working in this people group. And we really want to be frontline partners with them in executing on the mission. And they ended up sending long-term workers, many short-term teams, hosting immigrants from our people group in their context, involving literally hundreds of people instead of just a handful of people that were on the missions team. And that really was a shift for them in their identity and how they perceived what their role was in the Global Great Commission.
Well, that may be inspiring to some of our listeners on the podcast, too. If you happen to think of yourself in a single dimension, donor, for example, does partner, even that word I think is helpful, Ted. It just opens a lot of doors of possibility.
Yeah, partner is a strong word. Partner is also another way to think about innovation is collaboration. It's through collaboration. And the tools that we have technologically that allow us to collaborate today are like none before. We are in the era of the potential for greatest collaboration, no question about it. And I also think that our status in the dominant culture as more and more of a minority culture, because we are becoming more and more of a minority in our larger cultures, that can actually be good for collaboration, because we used to fight about things that we thought were important, but now we think of those things maybe not as important as really survival. But collaboration just gives so many opportunities for us to work together and to innovate. And Nobody's going to accomplish a Great Commission on their own. I mean, it's ridiculous for us to even consider that happening. So we should, even at the local church level, be thinking about, in what ways are we collaborating with others to see the Global Great Commission completed.
That's a great word. And that's going to provide us with a great segue. In just a moment, we're going to ask Ted to share some advice for missions committees, folks serving in local congregations, about how to maybe become a bit more innovative in your ministry. Before we get to that part of the conversation, we'd like to share with you this missions resource that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
Sending missionaries is a church-wide effort, from the pews to the pulpit. But how do you cast a vision that inspires your church members to action? Teams Casting a Vision for Missions Guide takes church leaders through the key questions they need to ask as they create a mission strategy. Determine your guiding principles, assess the resources God has given you, and build your plan for success. Go to team.org/podcast to learn more. That's team.org/podcast. And now, back to today's conversation.
We're back with Ted Esler, the president of Missio Nexus and the author of the book, The Innovation Crisis, Creating Disruptive Influence in the Ministry You Lead. Ted, we would like to turn our attention a bit toward local churches. We have many of our listeners, will say it that way, are serving in a local church. They may be on a missions committee. They may be a pastor. What could we offer by way of practical advice for churches to become more innovative as they think about missions?
Again, this is an area where I think there is so much room for fun creativity. It gets me excited to think about it. Many of us in a local church missions program, we kind of inherit some built-in momentum that's already there. And, I have served on the missions team in a local church and have done it actually a number of years. And you join a team, it's already in place, and they already got things going on. That has a tendency to almost fight against innovation, because it squeezes you into the status quo. And that's not on purpose, but that's just kind of how it happens. So one way to make sure that you don't fall into that rut is to really have some purposeful thinking about what it is you're doing as a team. A lot of teams today, they've got a policy statement or a vision statement, making sure that's aligned with the larger church and what's going on. That's kind of been a lot of what I'd call the emphasis in good church missions for the last decade or two. I would just add to that, there's many new tools out there for designing services and ways of going about the work. So design thinking is a big topic in the business world. It's nothing new. It's been around probably 30 years, but its ministry application, I would say, has really only been in the last few years. And design thinking is simply a set of methodologies that you can employ to do evaluation about what your either service or product is. And of course, with ministry, we're almost always talking about service. And within there is a subset of design thinking called service design. And just to give you a real high level of example of how it might work, in service design, let's say you're designing a coffee shop. They'll tell you need to think about your coffee shop through the eyes of your customer. You walk into the coffee shop, what's the first thing you notice and see? You interact with the person behind the counter. How does that make you feel? This kind of deep thinking about that interaction is kind of a high level way of looking at design thinking. Design thinking is actually a little more specific. I'm just talking to you about one of the stages, which is empathizing. But if you were to try to empathize, for example, about what a potential missionary feels like coming to your church to think about partnering with you in Global Great Commission work, what does that look like? How do you empathize with them? Now, there's like I said, there's 5 total stages to design thinking. And I highly recommend that you as a team think about those 5 stages, do some learning together on design thinking, and evaluate what you're actually doing. It'll go a long way toward improving your serve as a missions team.
Well, this is helpful, and it's true. It could sound a little technical, design thinking, it's methodologies or whatever, but I think you've provided some helpful primer ideas. I'm thinking, okay, a missions committee is meeting and they know they're going to have a missionary family coming on home service or furlough, whatever it might be called, soon. it would be possible to use design thinking, right? Just to think through, okay, how are we going to care for this missionary family while they're home from the field?
Absolutely. That's a perfect application of design thinking. Design thinking is actually a fun process. It sounds like a technical business-oriented process, but there's a brainstorming time. One of the 5 areas is called prototyping, in which you test out ideas. And it's really fun. It's not onerous. And it's not, even though it kind of grew out of the business world, I would just say that the applications for ministry are many.
Well, I like that you call it fun, because I think it's true. And the excitement that we see rising up when, for example, we're working with a church to anticipate a family coming home, the lights start coming on. It's like, hey, we could do this. We could do that. And what if we tried this? And some of those elements begin to rise up, and it brings a spark and a blessing not only to the missionary family, but to that committee as well.
Totally does. And the other thing I'd say about design thinking is it's really great for teams that are trying to innovate together. When we think about innovators, we think about Elon Musk, Edison, Tesla, Einstein, etc. Those are all kind of individualized innovators, but ministry is a team sport, and design thinking provides a way for you to work together with others to create innovative solutions. And so that's another reason why it's a great fit for a local church missions team.
Well, we want to turn our attention a bit toward resources. And I wonder, Ted, do you have any particular resource that you would recommend if a committee is listening or someone on a missions committee said, we really need to learn some more about that? Do you have a particular resource that you'd recommend with regard to design thinking?
Well, of course, there's my book, in which you'll get a high-level overview. If you want to get serious about design thinking, it emanated out of a European organization called IDEO, I-D-E-O. But all you got to do is go to the internet, put in design thinking, and you're gonna get crushed with resources. Okay, that's one of the funny things to me about design thinking is it is so ubiquitous, it's so prevalent in the business world, but in ministry, not so much. But it should be, because, like I said, if you go and you just Google it, you are going to find many, many resources out there for you to look at. But I just suggest you look at as well service design, this subset that's focused on service and not product development.
Sure, because most of our committees are not going to be producing a product as much as they are serving, right? Let's go a little broader then. Resources just with regard to innovation. Of course, we do want to mention again Ted's book, The Innovation Crisis. But what else would you provide as far as resource for our listeners?
For big picture innovation, well, there's a couple of other titles about ministry innovation that are out there. If you want to study it theologically, you can go to Amazon and type in Theology of Innovation, and there's kind of a heavy text out there that hits on that. If you want to look more at ideation and the creation of new ideas, I would look at decision-making tools. So, for example, you've probably heard of, I think it's called an Eisenhower chart. That's when you have 4 quadrants, high, low, etc. Those types of tools, and there's probably 5 or 6 major ones out there, are all great in the design thinking process. There's probably about 150. They call them games often in the design thinking world. I don't like calling them games because people then think they're not serious, but they are serious. They're ways of thinking about what you're doing with a group to come up with great innovative ideas. And so I would look for design thinking methods or design thinking games. And you'll turn up all sorts of ways of talking about what you're doing that you've never tried before and envisioning what you're doing. The real issue for people in ministry is not the availability of resources or even finding the resources. It's realizing that innovation needs to be a part of what I'm doing and taking the initiative to just go to get out there purposefully innovating on what you're seeking to accomplish. That's the real challenge.
Ted, I wonder, in your experience, if you've come across a church or a ministry in particular. Church would be great if you could illustrate where you've seen innovation really working well. They're really striving into it.
Sure. I'll give you an example that it goes back to, I think it was 2007 when the iPhone first came out. There were 200 apps in the iTunes App Store. And one of those apps was a Bible app, believe it or not. And that app had been designed and produced by a church. Now, I want you to think about what it was like to be in the church leadership team meeting when one of the members said, "Hey, I want to spend some time creating a Bible app." And the person across the room would say to them, "A what?" And they said, "A Bible app. It's a program that runs on your phone." And, maybe the top administrator in the church opens his Nokia phone up or flips it open and says, "How do apps run on your phone?" And the person says, "Well, listen, this is going to be a major way for us to minister to people all around the world. We will extend our presence everywhere if we can create this app." Well, eventually the church did it. And if you've ever used the YouVersion Bible app on your iPhone or your Android phone, then you know about that app. And that is an example of what in the book I call stakeholder innovation. And that has to do with defining who the stakeholders for your ministry are. Now, in that church, that person was saying the stakeholders in our ministry are not just the people coming on a Sunday morning or to house community groups. Our constituency are people all around the world that might read the Bible on their phones. And by having a view of who their stakeholder was, different than what we tend to think of, which we tend to think of our stakeholders in the church as being those people that are coming every Sunday. Those tend to be the stakeholders. By innovating on that, they have opened up for themselves an area of ministry where they have influenced literally over 1 billion people through this little piece of software that they developed many years ago.
Incredible. And at the time, we hardly would have known how to describe it or understand it.
It's truly innovative. Now, you can do stakeholder innovation in your local church quite easily on a much smaller and more reachable scale. For example, all of us pretty much are living in communities where there's massive immigration happening. And one way that a ministry can innovate is to think about how they can change the stakeholder from the people that are coming into the church every week to those people that are outside the church. One of the drawbacks to that has been that when churches get serious about immigration ministry, they almost always have a come to us model. They invite those immigrants into their church. They hold ESL classes so people get exposed to their church building, etc. I would suggest the real innovation is going to happen when you actually go out in their communities and you try to start ministry within their own unique cultural context that they're living in, instead of trying to invite them to bridge the cultural gap and come into yours.
Well, you can hear in these ideas, even as Ted processes this single idea, the come to us, the nature of that, we're maybe naturally inclined that way. It presses us into innovation, thinking in fresh ways. How do we go to them? Ted, I've got a question for you, and it might be more about change management really than innovation. But what would you say to a fellow servant, a sister or brother on a missions committee, and they've said, Ted, I've tried in my context to innovate, and it's just hard. It's meeting with resistance, and the rest of the committee or maybe someone in the pastoral staff is resistant. What would you say to someone who would like to innovate and they're trying, it's not working out yet?
Well, first thing I would say is that resistance is an awesome sign that you're doing something. You might not be doing the right thing, but you're doing something. And, resistance is just a part of the game. Failure, doing something and failing is a part of the game. We have to actively resist giving into failure when it comes to creativity, because we'll bomb for sure. We're going to fail. We can talk about, there's always the story of Edison. I don't know how many light bulbs he created before the light bulb worked, and that's the failure story. But that's typically not, those types of experimental failures, they're not the ones that cause us to just sit down and shut up and do our job like we've always done it. It tends to be more public, more social failure in terms of, people in our circles are aware of the failure, and that shames us or makes us feel like we're not able to move forward. But we really have to embrace the idea that we're going to get resistance and we're going to fail. So I would say the first thing I would say is, that's a good sign. That means something is happening in the right direction.
All kinds of great ideas in there too. A willingness to fail. And if you're an influencer in your church, if you're a pastor, could you help create space where it isn't a guaranteed win, but you try something? And it's done with good intention. It's not reckless or frivolous. There's good intention, there's good thinking, but it's not a guaranteed win. Maybe you're an influencer could help create some healthy space for some innovation as well. So
in those areas of failure and resistance are also the fertilizer for new innovation. Because when you meet up with the resistance, then you need to start asking yourself, why the resistance? What am I doing that's not doing, that double thing that Jesus did? Somehow I'm not being Jewish enough when I'm speaking to the Jews because I'm getting this kind of resistance. Maybe I'm only focusing on the confrontational side. So finding that balance, I would just say, good on you, lean into it more, continue, and eventually you'll get a breakthrough. And if the area that you're working in is just not ripe and open to innovation, then maybe the innovation is for you to change that ministry environment. I don't know. The Lord will lead in that.
Well, this is super, just great to visit over these ideas, Ted. In a moment, I've got my favorite final question for Ted, but I just ask this, it's not about content, it's about contact. Ted, if any of our listeners would like to just reach out to you to perhaps engage with you on this, they've had a look at your book. By the way, you can find Ted's book on Amazon. It's in paper copy. It's in a Kindle copy or digital version as well. But if they want to reach out to you, Ted, how might they do that?
The easiest thing to do is go to our website, missionexus.org, go to the contact form on that website, and it will get to me.
There you go. All of these ideas we'll capture in our show notes. You can find them, as usual, at globalmissionspodcast.com. Ted, the last question that I like to ask, it's a little bit standard with regard to this content about innovation now, thinking especially about that. If you have the opportunity to stand in front of a group of faithful Christ followers who serve on missions committees and pastors, they have the opportunity to help shape and guide faithful thinking in their church. They want to do a good job of missions, and they're interested, especially in this topic of innovation. What would you like to say to them?
I would say the primary thing that they should be thinking about is, what is our mission? What is our specific calling? What is the problem that God has called us as a group of faithful Christians to focus in on and serve through? What is that thing? Because the more defined that thing is, the more likely it is that you're going to innovate on it and that you are going to create solutions to solve that problem. And every church is unique, and every church has a unique history, and just the way God has worked through them. They're all different, and they're made up of people that are different, so they're different. And I think really leaning into that question, what is the thing that God is trying to solve through us? When we started this podcast, you asked me what Missio Nexus is about. And I was able to respond to you by saying, Missio Nexus catalyzes relationships, ideas, and collaboration within the Great Commission community. That is our mission statement. And it's natural enough that I can say it to you in a sentence and you don't hear it like it's a mission statement, from IBM or Microsoft or some company. It's a ministry mission statement. And I would just say, define and clearly state what your mission is as a team in terms of how God's called you to work in this global Great Commission. Because if you do that, a lot of things can fall into place quite well.
That's a great word. Ted, it's been, as always, a pleasure to talk with you today. Thanks so much for taking time and joining with our community on the Global Missions Podcast.
Thank you so much. Go out there and innovate.
Well, from this conversation with Ted, we're reminded again that innovation is a challenge, but it's a challenge we really do need to face. We would like, from our team, to shout some encouragement to those of you who are seeking to wisely innovate in missions without changing the gospel message, of course. We also want to say thank you to those of you who are facilitating and sometimes supporting efforts, creating a pathway, or financially supporting innovative new ideas, even when there is a measure of risk involved. Thank you. We earnestly hope that all of this will lead us to some good learning, some good thinking, and continued effective service in missions. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, an online collection of resources especially for senders, pastors, missions committees, and family and friends of workers sent to serve in missions. We invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.